Okay, we're just waiting for the live stream to start. Okay. All right. Well, I have it on good authority that we are now live. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're watching today. This is Tom Ashby. I'm the head of communications at the International Energy Forum, and I'll be emceeing the event for you today. We're hosting the first symposium on critical minerals outlooks, co-hosted by the Future Minerals Forum in collaboration with the Payne Institute. So we're hosting this on Zoom for a select number of participants, but we're also live streaming to hundreds of people watching on the live stream. And there will be a recording available after the event. We've got a fabulous lineup of speakers for you today, and starting with, of course, the Secretary General of the International Energy Forum, Joe McMoneagle, and of course the co-host of today's event, His Excellency, Vice Minister of Mining at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Khalid Al-Madeifa. So just in terms of the Q&As, Zoom participants can ask questions using the Q&A button, and anybody watching the live stream who has a question, please feel free to send it in to qa@ief.org by email, and we have a moderator who is monitoring that channel, and we will get those questions answered for you. So thanks very much for attending today, and without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Joe McMoneagle, Secretary General of the IEF. Joe, take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. Hello to everybody, and I'd like to open by welcoming you all to the IEF's first Symposium on Critical Minerals Outlooks. As Tom said, co-hosted by the Future Minerals Forum in collaboration with the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. I extend a warm welcome to all the participants on the Zoom call, and also those watching on the live stream, where I understand we had hundreds of people register for the live stream. I understand that this event falls in the middle of the summer holiday season, and I hope you're all enjoying what's left of your summer. So for a very special thank you to all of you for taking time to be with us today. And I also wish to thank in particular Morgan Bazillion and the team at the Payne Institute for agreeing to work with us on this Outlooks comparison report, which is available on our website and informs our discussions today. I'd also like to thank Aldo Panini and Andrew Davies and the team at the Future Minerals Forum for their support in organizing this symposium. And of course, special thanks to our co-host, His Excellency Vice Minister of Mining of Saudi Arabia, Khalid Al-Madeifa, for agreeing to join us and offering some remarks today. Finally, I must thank the team at the IEF for getting this event together in record time, in particular Mason Hamilton, Tom Ashby, and Lena Murad. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is our first Symposium on Critical Minerals Outlooks, and we believe it fills an important gap in our work. Because of the availability of minerals will be an important factor in delivering the clean energy transition. Energy market experts often lack a clear understanding of the supply outlooks for minerals, while the minerals community often lacks clarity on the demand expected from clean energy technologies. As our report outlines, the energy transition has already affected critical mineral supply chains, prices, and demand. But the transition is so complex that minerals demand will continue to be very difficult to forecast, especially in the medium to long term. Projections unanimously see massive deployment of battery electric vehicles, wind, solar, and other mineral-intensive technologies. But demand will depend on energy demand, new technologies, costs, emissions, and other consumer preferences. This report highlights the vast amount of uncertainty, I think, that is inherent in the main outlooks. This area of study is in its infancy, and the outlooks we compared in our first report should be considered the first generation of their kind. Improved data collection and more collaboration between the energy modeling community and the mining community will yield, I think, better, standardized, and more comprehensive outlooks in the future. So this is a timely meeting and one in which we hope to repeat in the future in person in 2024. And so without any further delay, I want to pass the floor to my esteemed colleague, His Excellency Khalid Al-Mudafer, the Vice Minister of Mining for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph, for a well-delivered welcome. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by thanking the International Energy Forum for allowing us to co-host this symposium during a critical time for both the mining and energy sectors. I am also delighted to have such a distinguished group of speakers at the symposium today. Thank you for making the effort to be involved. In the space of just 3 to 5 years, critical minerals have gone from a relatively mysterious concept to a major issue for policymakers and businesses around the world. In today's world, minerals play a crucial role in healing our planet, but we are facing two main challenges. We need to quickly discover and produce more minerals. We must ensure our society support and enable permitting mineral production. Our shared green future and energy transition ambitions require that we find new and stable sources for critical minerals. Critical minerals demand for clean energy technologies, such as electrical vehicles, solar panels, and wind turbines, is forecasted to rise at least 4 times by 2040. This includes phosphate, graphite, cobalt, manganese, vanadium, and nickel. The current copper, lithium, and platinum supplies are inadequate to satisfy the future needs. Saudi Arabia is the world's 4th largest net importer of minerals. The kingdom has committed more than $1 trillion of investments in projects that would require massive quantities of minerals. The best example of this, NEOM, the smart city in the Red Sea coast, that has a total area of 33 times the size of New York City, and will be powered exclusively by clean energy, including wind and solar power, as well as with the world's largest hydrogen plant. Additionally, the National Industrial Strategy, which was launched by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince as part of the Vision 2030, will further increase demand for industries such as automotive, aerospace, renewables, and defense, as well their supply chains. For example, we aim to manufacture more than 300,000 EVs annually for 2030. To meet this massive increase in demand for Saudi Arabia, miners for the world, not only Saudi Arabia, miners will need to advance to new jurisdiction and in new spaces that might be difficult to access. More advanced technologies and know-how will also be critical to facilitate efficient and environmentally friendly targeting and extraction methods. The mineral-rich region that stretches from Africa to Western and Central Asia, which we call the super region, has tremendous potential to become a game changer in developing resilient and responsible mineral value chain. The region encompasses 79 countries, covering 33% of the world's land, and hosts 40 to 50% of the world's mineral resources. Yet, it only receives 12% of the global mining exploration spending. This highlights the need to accelerate economic developments, mining capacity, and infrastructure in the region, with large implication as both commodity supplier and goods producer to the good markets. As part of Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia has taken steps to support the transition to green energy. and secure critical minerals. I would like to touch on some example of how we are making investments to supply and enable the transition. We have launched exploration programs to identify and assess potential mineral deposits in the country. We are collaborating with international investors to develop the mineral sector. These partnerships aim to leverage their expertise in the exploration, mining, and processing of critical minerals. We are also partnering with countries and private sectors and research and R&D center that possess the advanced technology in the mineral sector. These collaborations involve knowledge transfers and technical assistance to develop the necessary know-how and expertise in mineral extraction, refining, and finished products. We have been working on creating a framework for the mineral sector. This framework aims to provide clear guidelines and regulations for exploration, mining, processing, semi-finished production, and export of critical minerals, ensuring environmental sustainability and resource management. We are offering investment incentive to attract both domestic and foreign investors in the mineral industries. Major locals champions have been conducting studies in Saudi Arabia to develop new techniques for extracting critical minerals from desalination waste and mine tailings. But we know that no country has it all. That is why the Public Investment Fund and our national mining champion, Ma'aden, created Manara Minerals, which was announced during the Future Mineral Forum in January to invest in mining assets globally and secure critical minerals that are essential for Saudi Arabia and the world. Saudi Arabia has all the right ingredients to become a world-class green and future minerals processing hub, strategically located as a gate to Asia, Africa, and Europe, with well-developed infrastructure and high domestic demand, availability of energy. The kingdom also has the vision and commitment to develop its mining sector, mineral sector, and a well-developed economy with high levels of growth and security. It was not too long ago that we came together at the Future Minerals Forum in January 2023. Saudi Arabia has launched this platform to enable regional conversations about maximizing the benefit from our collective mineral endowment by establishing mineral value chains that have local communities at their heart. To achieve this, producing country from the region and customer countries must work together, and this is where the FMF can serve as a space for these conversations. The focus of Future Mineral Forum is in the super region, providing a voice for a part of the world that has not had a significant presence in the global discussion on minerals. We have invited the region to own this event, but put forward in perspective from the global south and east, and take action to supply its share of the minerals and metals the world demands. But we need to be realistic about what can be achieved in a short space of time and ensure the energy transition is well managed. In the race to increase supply, we need to be aware of the trade-offs and unintended consequences, including a negative impact on local community and the environment. At the end of FMF last January, we closed by setting out 4 initiatives to further action: defining requirements and action for the Sorba region, covering the supply and share of the minerals in the world, creating center of excellence to enable the region to achieve its fair share of development from minerals by helping to build institutional capacity and delivering the green technologies, revising sustainability standards to reflect the views of host countries founded on transparency and certification of supply, creating green metals hubs in the region enabled by new technologies. Since January, we've been turning this initiative into action and have been working with international organizations and partners on setting out objectives, recommendations, and plans. Today, we are building on the momentum by convening this group of speakers. We want to hear from you on the critical minerals outlook, and we want to work with you to develop solutions. I invite you to join us in January 2024 to continue to turn this conversation into action. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for some very useful opening remarks. Now we're going to turn to Morgan Bazilian, who is the director of the Payne Institute for Public Policy, Colorado School of Mines. I would just, before I hand over the floor to you, Morgan, I would just point out that in addition to this symposium, we have now published the Critical Minerals Outlooks Comparison Report, which is available on the IEF website. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Morgan.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a pleasure for us to co-host this meeting with the International Energy Forum and the Future Minerals Forum. Both organizations do tremendous work globally, and we're honored to be included. The area of critical minerals has, as you and the Secretary General and the Minister have said, risen to the top of minds at the political level globally. That's a new phenomena. And likewise, as we've said here, the scenarios to consider what the world might look like in the future is a relatively new area of study. It also has the complexity that it merges the two worlds of energy and mining. And that's not always easy, as we know. So as Thomas has said, the short report, it's a non-comprehensive report, has launched. It's on the International Energy Forum website. It's a first pass looking at several different minerals outlooks. And I'm going to show just a few of the key results as in a very short time here. We looked at 11 publicly available results from 8 different organizations published within the last 4 years. So that does not include, largely that does not include the academic literature. That is just the international organizations with one exception. There are 28 different materials that are mentioned across the 11 reports. In some jurisdictions like the United States, those are called critical minerals, and some they're not. And they have very different definitions of criticality. There's about 8, the number of minerals we found that had comparable data across these multiple reports. The reports we used include excellent work from a wide variety of international and national organizations, including the International Renewable Energy Agency, that's IRENA. There was 3 reports we looked at over the past couple of years. The International Energy Agency, and we looked at 2 different reports. The World Bank, the Institute for Sustainable Future, the consulting company McKinsey, the Catholic University of Leuven, something called the Energy Transitions Commission, and the German Mineral Resources Agency. So those make up the scenarios we looked at. So again, it does not include the academic literature for the most part. And here are those 8 minerals. We see aluminium, cobalt, copper, graphite, lithium, neodymium, nickel, and silver. These have become part of the wider rhetoric and vocabulary of critical minerals. it should be said that the reports we looked at are energy focused. So they are energy transitions focused. Therefore, the demand that they model or the demand that they conceive of comes from future energy systems. That is not, in general, the wider demand for these minerals and metals. So this is just the energy use of these minerals and metals. And I should say, the minister made an excellent point to allude to refining and production of refined chemicals. For the most part, there's a little bit of gray area between the minerals demand and the demand for chemicals. And that continues in this type of scenario exercise. But as you can see here across the various scenarios we looked at, the assumptions around what role renewable energy plays, a percentage in the overall mix, varies dramatically. And therefore, naturally, the results do as well. So what we tried to do across these 8 minerals, and I'm not going to go through each one, they're in the report. And I should stop and say here, thanks to Juliet Acombo from the Payne Institute and Mason Hamilton at the International Energy Forum for their extraordinary work pulling this together in a short period of time. We will continue to refine this work and look forward to those partners who are watching online to do that with. Excuse me. Here's cobalt. And you can see on the right some of the different data points, either over time or in specific decades or years, 2030, 2040, going out to 2050, that they vary quite significantly. The demand issues, again, just from energy transitions. And this has to do with assumptions about primarily from car batteries, lithium-ion batteries that use cobalt in this case. And what we tried to do here is just make it sort of simple to see the various scenarios outputs. And so you can see we have the median projected energy transition demand in 2040 of 308 kilotons. The current producer today have about 130 kilotons in the DRC, so quite a bit more, and again, just for energy. One important thing to keep in mind about scenarios, of course, is that they're always wrong. The exercise of scenarios is not to make or try to make exact prescriptions or projections into the future, but rather to help various decision makers, analysts, researchers, international organizations, investors, etc., make reasonable decisions about the future given the wide uncertainty. And I think that's especially important in this area, given that even the assumptions and the parameters of these studies vary fairly widely. So we went through the 8 different comparable minerals that we saw. And again, while projections of future critical minerals demand requirements are necessary, and that is necessary to understand the scale of the challenge a mineral-driven energy transition presents. And there we say mineral-driven energy transition, that is, the future energy system is likely, highly likely, to be much more mineral intensive than the current one. And so that is the reason why these organizations would put out these kind of scenarios to try to inform future decision making. It's equally necessary to understand the vast amount of uncertainty that's inherent in such exercises. The reports surveyed for this exercise should be considered the first generation of their kind. That is, there's not a long history of this kind of scenario exercise, as you well know, and have attended different International Energy Forum events in this genre. The energy scenarios have been going on for decades, and they are myriad. And so this is a start for the mineral-driven look. Improved data collection, increased collaboration between the energy modeling community and the metals and mining community will yield inevitably better, standardized, and more comprehensive outlooks in the future. And that's why we hope to continue this discussion. And again, let me thank the extraordinary partners at the IEF and the IEF-FMF, and turn it back over to Thomas. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Morgan, for that excellent opening remarks. It's obviously a very complex and very nascent area of study, which we look forward to working with you to develop and refine in the future. So the next, now we're going into our panel sessions. We have two panel sessions. The first is on outlook analysis and scenarios, global critical minerals supply and transition requirements. So really building on what Morgan has been introducing there. And to moderate this session, I'm pleased to hand over to Ernie Shader at Reuters, who will be the moderator of this session. And then he'll hand it back to me for the second panel session. So over to you, Ernie.
Great to be with you, Tom, and great to be with everyone here today at the IEF, at the Payne Institute, and so many others. As Tom mentioned, I'm Ernie Scheider with Reuters, and I'm joined today by a top-notch panel to discuss the global critical minerals supply and transition requirements. Our panelists today include Saad Rahim, the chief economist from Trafigura, Elizabeth Press, the director of planning and program support at IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and Atul Arya, the chief energy strategist at S&P Global. A quick planning note that Grant Spohr from Bloomberg Intelligence was not able to make it today at the last minute, but we thank him and look forward to future opportunities. We're meeting, as our previous speakers discussed, at a really interesting inflection point in the demand for critical minerals and metals as much of our world strives to go green amid the transition. And we have this excellent report that came out from IEF and the Payne Institute that Morgan Bazilian was just unpacking for us. And I'd like to sort of dive right in and start with you, Saad, to get your thoughts from the Trafigura perspective on how you're thinking through the many reports that are out there. You know, Morgan was just alluding to that, but there's so many reports. And I'm wondering, just from your perspective, if we could just start out right at the top, how Trafigura is thinking through these many reports out there and then positioning itself to supply those minerals and metals as the demand increases across the world.
Thank you, Ernie, and thank you to the IEF and the Future Minerals Forum for having us here. So, quick note for those of you who may not be familiar with us, so Trafigura, we're one of the world's largest physical energy traders. We're also the world's largest physical metals trader. So we really sit right in the middle of this energy transition discussion and really kind of looking ahead at some of these numbers. I mean, I think from our perspective, what we've seen is that there's been just structural underinvestment on the supply side over really the last decade at this point, so from 2014 onwards to today, and even looking forward. And yet we're entering now a period that is completely different from really the last 20 years, where for the last 20 years, the only game in town really was China and China's demand growth. If you take copper, for example, as one of the ones that was mentioned, over the 2010 to 2020 period, Chinese demand growth was more than the rest of the world's really combined, in the sense of China grew by 5 million tons. The rest of the world's demand actually declined by 1 million tons. Now, looking ahead, when we look at that, that is completely reversing. China still grows by about 4 or 5 million tons of demand, but the rest of the world grows by almost 7 million tons over that time period, right? So to go from actually declining to actually very significant growth over that time period is a real sea change in what we're used to from these markets. And what's interesting is, really when we look at a lot of especially the supply forecasts across all these metals, we really only have visibility out to 2030. And yet when we think about the energy transition, we are talking about goals that are all the way out to 2050. So when we struggle to say, or when we say we may struggle to meet even the demand out to 2030 for a lot of these projects, really looking at that long-term, outlook really is where the challenge, I think, really starts to become very, very apparent. And for us, I think the scale of the underinvestment really requires, kind of a global rethink around how do we supply this. I mean, you can look at any number of the forecasts. I mean, I think the report does a great job, looking at all that. But what's interesting about it is, we hear about peak oil demand, but we never hear about peak copper demand. every demand forecast line is some version of kind of straight and up and to the right. So even where we might see some substitution, some thrifting, more scrap, more whatever it is, the scale of the challenge is quite apparent, right? And for those of you who may be coming more from the energy side, I mean, in copper alone, the type of the supply deficits that we're looking at are equivalent to blowing a 20 million barrel a day hole in the oil market by 2030, right? Mm-hmm. So for us, that really kind of speaks to, I think, the challenges that are out there.
Awesome. Thank you, Saad. Quick programming note, I should notice we'll be chatting amongst the panelists for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for question and answers from the audience. So if you do have a burning question for our experts, please save that for the last 10 minutes of this session. I want to go to Elizabeth at ARENA. And Elizabeth, this is the 1-year anniversary this week of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. And when we think about demand and supply, as Saad just mentioned, we're going to have sort of an exponential increase in a lot of these minerals and metals outside of China. How are you and ARENA thinking through this demand in light of the Inflation Reduction Act? Did we just sort of see this wildly outperform expectations even when it was signed last year?
Yeah, thanks, Ernest, and very nice to be with everybody. Congratulations to Morgan and the team on an excellent report. And we actually have done some dives on some of the things around the geopolitical dynamics and all that. You're absolutely right. The demand side is crystallizing, which is really, really good, because obviously the U.S. strategies has made a quite a big shift in the trajectory for energy transition. But you should also look at the European markets, the European strategy, energy strategy, and also the global demand in the global south as well, which is changing. And what we have seen, we see it in this sort of three parts, if you wish, the way that this is going to evolve. We're going to have really tight markets in next decade or so, as Saad was saying, and it's very clear that the energy community has not really looked at this angle at all. We're now waking up and trying to sort of catch up and understand what it is. But there are two other aspects that need to be looked in parallel. One is the disruptive innovation that brings quite a lot of uncertainty into projections on the demand side, and we have already seen that in the battery evolution since 2015. In our analysis, we were looking at what happened in the last 7 years in the battery thing, and then how cobalt, for instance, demand for cobalt has dramatically changed and kind of shifted towards lithium. And then the third bucket of issues comes with the recycling and the circular economy. So you really have to have a little bit more holistic outlook of how this is going to play out. But whichever way you look, we know that the volumes, the energy will drive volumes, and how we manage the next 10 years will have consequences. This is not an energy security like you have. This is energy transition issue, the speed of transition, how quickly can we have enough emissions by 2030 for climate change. And obviously at generic sort of critical materials blob, but kind of break it down one by one, looking at what exactly is relevant in the economic context and how they can manage this market crunch in the next market squeeze in the next decade or so.
Fascinating. Thank you. Atul, I want to turn to you. Elizabeth mentioned destructive innovation, and I'm curious your thoughts on if you can maybe dive into that a little bit more from your perspectives on innovation and how different new extraction techniques, especially from non-traditional partners, could help upend the supply scenario here.
Yeah, thank you, Ernest, for the question, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I hope you can all hear me all right.
We can, yes.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So let me address your question, and then I'll make a couple of other points. I think one of the things we have seen, across the energy industry is that when there is a need, there is innovation, right? If you remember no more like 15 years back, we were thinking, there'll be no more sources of oil. It'll all be coming from conventional sources. And then there comes the unconventional revolution. And we saw so much more oil and gas come online in the last 15 years. So I think we're going to see something similar in my view, that there will be more innovation. Clearly, recycling, which was mentioned briefly in the report, is going to be important, but we're going to need new sources. And demand right now is driven by IRA and other similar, the Repower EU, and of course the Chinese demand hasn't come down. So one example of that disruptive innovation would be what we're seeing in the world of lithium, with direct lithium extraction. So oil and gas industry, which knows very well how to drill a well, how to inject water, how to get water out of the well or oil out of the well, is now getting very excited about this lithium extraction, not really to get into the battery manufacturing and all that, but into supplying lithium. So I think we're going to see some of that new innovation around the globe. And in the US, we are seeing that in the large oil and gas companies. Just another point to make, going back to the IRA, we are tracking in S&P the overall IRA investment. And again, money kind of brings innovation to table. So we are seeing a lot of money driven by IRA from the DOE, from the loan programs office within the DOE, and mining. We are surprised somewhat by how much more mining activity has been there in the US. So I think it's a fairly interesting space right now. And it's only 1 year. Tomorrow will be 1 year anniversary of the IRA. So it's a long way to go. I think one challenge we have, going back to what Saad said about, analogy to oil and gas, what we found with unconventional was short cycle oil, right? We were able to drill and produce very quickly. I am not aware of any short cycle lithium or short cycle copper, right? I mean, as Saad were saying, it takes a long time to get and we only have visibility to 2030. I think we need more of that innovation. Can we do, much more recycling, for example, or the direct lithium extraction? Could that be sped up to get things, faster? Because right now we see, at least in the medium, short term, to the end of this decade, medium term, a big, imbalance between supply and demand, driven by all the incentives which are out there.
That's interesting. Thank you, Atul. Saad, I wonder your thoughts on recycling and how do you see it fitting into the supply-demand scenario here? I know folks are all over the map when it comes to recycling. Some say, recycling's moment is now. Others say 10, 15 years from now, it'll have its moment in the sun. How do you think through recycling's ability to address supply?
I mean, I think it depends very much on the metal and, what we're talking about. So, for example, copper, a large part of the market already is scrap or recycling, but you need that to continue to grow. But the problem is also, a lot of it is already being used in the sense of you can scrap ships or older ships or whatever for the steel value, but you're not going to scrap your car or tear down your house to get the copper wiring out, right? So there are limits, I think, on the upper side on that. Aluminium, you already have a lot of, again, recycling that happens, so that continues on. But some of the other areas like lithium, like others, that technology is still very new and does need to get rolled out and in scale. So it does depend, but I think across all of these metals, I think that is going to be a critical part of it. But to go back to what I think Atul was saying and alluding to, really, a lot of this is also going to come down to incentives, meaning price, right? Ultimately, the solution for all these things is going to be time and money, but you need time and you need money, and money in this case being a higher incentive price. And we saw that very much so with the oil side, right? I mean, the technology to do fracking, horizontal drilling had been around actually for decades, but it required sustained oil prices, above $100 to unlock that, right? To make it economic for people to say, okay, we want to do this. And again, we're today not aware of technologies that may be out there that can allow us to do short cycle copper or aluminium, or at least we need a higher price that then says, look, we want to try some of the more unproven technologies to be able to scale those up because now those are worth it. And I think just, again, going back to some of the context around the challenges, one of the things we talk about on the copper side, right, is it's a 30, 40, 50 problem, right? As in the average project size is now 30% smaller than it was over the last decade. It costs at least 40% more in terms of CapEx and takes at least 50% longer, right, to bring on. So, this is a kind of a real struggle that we've had. And even with prices having remained fairly high over the last few years, similar to on aluminium, right, it's not a question of resource as much as it is capacity. All of the capacity pretty much over the last 20 years has been built in China, that they've now capped that, and we're approaching that cap over the next year or so, right? So now when we look at it and we say, well, we need to build, I think the report says basically 0.8 80% of what China has has today, and we're seeing almost zero of that being built anywhere, really. I'm exaggerating a bit, but the point being, it's nowhere near that scale. So what is the incentive price, and what changes also shareholder incentives around saying, look, we want companies to go out, build new mines, build new projects in a way that we have not seen, at least in the last few years.
Awesome. Thank you, Saad. Elizabeth, Saad said something that I'd love to get your perspectives on, that the average copper mine right now is 30% smaller than in years past. And of course, a host of reasons why mines might physically be smaller, or the development timeline might be delayed. But from your perspective, from ARENA's perspective, how does the strong movement, I would say, across some parts of the world to resist mines, whether for religious or indigenous rights reasons or environmental reasons, affect the supply scenario? I mean, certainly it does have an effect, but I'm wondering how you see it when we think 5, 10, 15, 20 years out, when we desire these metals and minerals to go green, but we have such a strong opposition among certain sectors.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question to ask, and one that is probably decisive in the way how we're going to move from now on, because we know that there is quite a patchy legacy of some of these projects, and that the local communities, I would say, the minimum did not get to benefit from, many local communities did not get to benefit from the natural resources that exist in the land. Today, I think Saad mentioned it, like there's no shortage of resources, viable resources, but like how do you reverse? But how do you manage to do it fast and in a way that actually is sustainable and environmentally acceptable. So the 54%, what we have seen, that 54% of these resources is in indigenous land, which needs to be addressed up front. And one of the issues is that local community needs to be part of the decision making. It needs to be involved really early on in the conversation around both how to harness these resources and also what is the local benefit. And we have seen that already happening in certain parts of the world, and it's going to be an absolute necessity to make sure that the benefits are shared more equally going forward. That's number one. Number two, there's a lot that can be done with the modern technologies, including energy technologies, to reduce the environmental intensity of mining processes. So, for instance, the use of renewable energy on site. That there's lots of trends that they're showing that you can actually reduce the footprint on site as well to reduce the environmental damage. So it really has to be a holistic approach that takes from the local engagement all the way through the understanding the life cycle and looking at each of the steps, how you can reduce the negative impact and maximize benefits. Awesome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Atul, I'm wondering if you could put your crystal ball hat on, if I could mix my metaphors here. An economist and energy strategists, love to look 20, 30 years down the road. And I'm wondering if there's any thing that you're expecting that could be unforeseen, aka a black swan event, or something that you might see potentially on the horizon, or something that you're preparing for that our audience should be thinking through that might not necessarily be immediately front of mind.
And that's, if it's a black swan event, I would be able to forecast it by definition.
Sure. Maybe just spitballing.
Yeah, I'll offer you a couple of ideas, right?
Sure.
I think whenever there is a need, there is demand, and as such, a price and demand, that will create a lot of incentive. So I think we are already seeing innovation in finding new sources, like the lithium example we just talked about, but also there is more exploration for these things, because we have a lot of unexplored areas. So to say, well, we know all the deposits of any of these minerals is, I think, a bit of an exaggeration, right? So we're going to see more of that. I think recycling is a really important question, and I know, can we really get recycling at the right cost, and the collection issues we Saad alluded to. And I'll give you one example. We have talked about plastic recycling forever, right? But still there is not enough of plastic recycling, because the chemical recycling is very expensive, and also collecting the material, separating in different colors is very expensive, right? So I think recycling could be a big game changer if it can be expanded. And I'll just give you one example. There's a company, Redwood Materials, some people may know. They've just received a $2 billion grant from Loan Program Office for recycling, scaling up their technology. I mean, that's the real money, right? So hopefully that kind of innovation will happen. And the third thing is that let's not forget technology development. So, in the case of battery, there was an excellent story in FT a couple of days back about NMC versus LFP battery technologies, for those who know, because one is a lot cheaper, but has certain constraints in terms of, how much you can recharge and all of the other things, how much charge you can hold. So I think there is, a lot of innovation to be had. I'm not a battery expert, but I follow biofuels much more. So analogy to that, we are kind of today, I would say, in kind of chapter 1, paragraph 3 of biofuels, right? Maybe chapter 1 is finishing and chapter 2 is starting. I think in some of these critical minerals, we are still in very early days. So I think even a year from today, if we have the same conversation, I have a feeling we will say, wow, here are some 10 new things which have happened, which we didn't even think about. So that's where I will leave it.
We'll save your
Saad has a
calendar.
comment, I think. Saad, you're on mute, by the way.
Okay. Well, I think excellent points. And I think that's exactly it, is that so much of what we don't know but it could go either way, right? So for example, one of the technologies that is out there is direct air carbon capture, right? So, we have that technology. Say it's not scalable, but if it turns out to be scalable over the next 20 years, you've actually eliminated the need to be able, to have to go into some of these things. So that's actually demand destructive. Similarly, what we saw, the kind of the hype around the LK99 superconductors, okay, that didn't pan out, it looks like, but that was suddenly a new source of demand for copper and lead that no one had on their radar, right? So it's these envelopes that we just don't know about, kind of what is out there. It could be either way. And I think where we are today, though, is to say, look, again, given what we know, even just through the end of this decade, I think that's what's so interesting to us, is say, how do we even address some of this stuff just going forward?
Awesome. Thanks, Saad. And Elizabeth, maybe thoughts on the potential unknown and how you and Irina think through it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to this, actually, that because it's so important to look across sectors and across the economy what's happening, because these dynamics, like for instance, on platinum, one of the examples, it's used in internal combustion engines. As the electric mobility advances, the platinum from that side will obviously, the demand will be reduced on that side. So it's really important to watch the entire economy, not just the energy sector. And I think this is one of the recommendations we are making to governments, to really understand, where these bottlenecks or red opportunities might pop up. And then there's the plenty of innovations, the ongoing innovations. I mean, number one, efficiency, and there's so much efficiency work. But then you have in the solar and battery chemistry, already mentioned in introduction, and it's really changing. It's almost, I think Atul mentioned it. It's like you should not be projecting anything, because it's so dramatically changing almost on a daily basis. And then in solar space as well, like perovskite solar cells, for instance, they've been around for a long, long time, but now they're really picking up. And the organic solar cells or quantum dot solar cells or whatever, there's a lot of stuff going on, and one watch. Nobody wants to be held hostage to advance. So innovation is really blossoming. I think on the recycling side, that's going to take a little bit of time, both in terms of to make a significant impact on supply side, because it's going to take energy assets of size. It's going to take a little while to come to end of life to be able to recover in significant volumes, because we're going to still have this mismatch for a while.
Gotcha. Thank you, Elizabeth. Before we toss it to questions, I just want to ask a broad inquiry of our panel. When we harken back to the 1990s, if you remember, we had DVD technology, if everyone can remember DVDs, and there was a huge movement to standardize DVD technologies for the players. And of course, that didn't really happen. You had to buy 4 different players, and who could afford that all? And there were different DVD types and different media outlets at different DVD standards. We're starting to see some host governments force adaptation for chargers. And I'm wondering, from a metals perspective, if you see a movement or expect a movement for battery chemistries? And if so, what that could mean for metals demand? AKA, do we start to see LFP be standardized by some host governments? And what could that mean for iron or for other metals demand, or NMC or NCA, et cetera, et cetera? It's sort of a high level thought, but I'm wondering if you think that's possible, and if so, what that could mean for metals demand. Just sort of throw it open to the three of you.
I don't think it's going to be really feasible to have one single technology, because there's such, and also remember, if you're in China, what is available there versus if you're in the US is so different that, and security of supply is going to be, and the cost obviously is going to be a key factor. And my thinking will be, let 1,000 flowers bloom and let get the best technologies. And if there is one dominant technology, solar is a good example. After all the efforts, I used to work in the solar business, we are basically down to conventional solar technology, which is what is now growing, right? Crystalline technology and different variations of it. So that may be where we end up. We end up with lithium battery, but different variations of lithium, or we may come up with some other technologies as well.
Gotcha. Elizabeth or Saad?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you can, to use kind of the analogy, right, is okay, when you go to the gas pump, right, the pump technology is standardized, but the vehicles are all totally different, right? So again, the charging technology may be standardized because and we're even seeing that in consumer electronics as well, but consumer demand, consumer preference will ultimately drive, I think, what the battery technology is. And also, if the supply is really predominantly now starting to come out of China, we're seeing what they're doing on the EV side. If they're choosing to adopt the LFP technology and push that out as opposed to one of the others, then that's what will drive it. But again, the consumers have to want to buy that, right? So I think you can put in some level of standardization and it makes sense, but then the ultimate end product, I think, is going to vary.
Yeah, just to add, I absolutely agree, because we are still in a very transitional sort of dynamic space, and to reflect a little bit on hydrogen, for instance, it really in the last few years picked up, and there's a lot of conversation about it, but in which application it's going to end up, it's still not clear, and that's going to have an impact on the materials, because if you go hydrogen, there's one side. If you go electrification, it's a different side. So I think there's a lot of things in motion, and we still need to leave it a little bit to innovation. And it's just super important to have these conversations, to have transparency, to have more information, and to have international cooperation and share information on these things, because we all on the steep learning curve and don't have time to waste.
Gotcha. Thank you, Elizabeth. So save your calendars for 1 year from now. We'll loop back at the second symposium. We've got a few minutes here for questions, and we've got a question that sort of loops back to where we started. It's around different scenarios, and the questioner asks, do the divergent and different scenarios for metals demands help spur investment decisions or make investment decisions more scary and difficult? Is there possibility, or is the unknown scary? I'll sort of throw it open to the three of you for potential thoughts for that questionnaire.
I would say very quickly. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I just want, because obviously, it's like we're coming from a different side. I think we looked at the number one, criticality of materials is a little bit location specific. So there's like the different regions maintain different lists of critical materials for different reasons. But when we look across all of them, there is an agreement along the layer of materials that definitely are critical for everybody. So I think in that space, even though there's uncertainties and all that, there's a little bit of consensus that provides stability for the downstream investment, in our opinion. So I think while some of the more sort of scarce and isolated and less visible parts are probably not that obvious, there's a layer like around lithium, for instance, or nickel demand that there is no ambiguity, and I think it's pretty stable outlook of forecast for it.
Thank you. Atul?
I was just going to say that, one good thing is that most of these metals, the demand is going up. So the question is really, how high versus, what is your comfort zone? So I think we need investments in all of that. And the big difference between those projections is really on assumption about how quickly energy transition will unfold, right? Is it at 2050? 1.5 degree net zero, or is it a 2070? So that's kind of where the differences are, but clearly everything is going to go up. I just want to say that to add to even more data in the mix, just today, this morning, my colleagues at S&P, led by Dan Yergin, have published a new report on the impact on North America metals and minerals market as a result of the IRA. I highly recommend you. It's available publicly and very detailed report. So adding more data to the debate.
More data is more welcome. And Saad, to you.
Well, look, I think, we've highlighted a lot of the challenges. I think, again, if we go differentiating by metals, right? So I think if you look at some of the battery metal specific side of things, there it really becomes a question of technology, chemistry, right? And that's why there is some hesitancy. Do we want to put all our eggs in one basket? Because if there is a technological breakthrough or something that, makes nickel cheaper or makes LFP more sense, that's a bit difficult. But again, something like copper and aluminum, you're looking at it going, well, even if you're using less maybe in the EV itself, but you still need the grid, you still need it in renewables, you still have a lot of other applications for it. But absolutely, I think, again, we're investors are looking at it going, okay, well, where do we want to put our, basically put the money? And it ultimately is going to come down to shareholders looking at the opportunity set and saying, look, that's something that we want these companies to participate in, which has not been the message really for the last 10 years, right? So when we look at CapEx versus dividends, for example, these ratios have completely inverted. And so companies are spending much more returning cash to shareholders rather than investing, partly because of the uncertainty. And to be fair, I don't know if we've seen a period where we are seeing all these different kind of technological breakthroughs, pathways in such a short period of time, right? Normally these technologies, it's, a 10, 20-year process to get rolling. And here we're saying, well, the battery chemistry could change, this could change, and so it makes it a little bit harder, I think, for people to have line of sight. And that just exacerbates a lot of this.
Awesome. I think it's a great place to transition to our next panel. Saad, Elizabeth, and Atul, thank you very much. And thank you to our audience for listening. A lot of moving parts here on this topic, and we look forward to future conversations with you all. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Ernie. That was a really great session and really free-flowing conversation. Great to see everyone animated by the topic. So coming into our second session, which is really focused on the policy response to the outlooks. Our session moderator is Jack Farshi, senior reporter for energy and commodities at Bloomberg News. And also, I should mention, co-author of the excellent book, The World for Sale, which was co-authored with our good friend, Javier Blas. So, Jack, with that, I will hand over to you for session 2, Navigating Investment, ESG, Price Dynamics and Permitting.
Thanks very much, Tom. I hope you can hear and see me. And that everyone else, excellent, glad to hear it, and everyone else can as well. So yes, as you said, I think we had a great discussion in the first panel on the outlook for all of these different markets. And really the question for this panel is, what is the right policy response? And I think it's a question for governments, both in big economies that are expecting to require lots of these critical minerals to be major consumers, major markets for electric vehicles, like the US, the EU and China, and also for those countries which are major producers. And we've seen this is a conversation that has been happening. We've been writing a lot about in places like Indonesia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Chile. So I've got a fantastic panel joining us today. We have Frank Fannon of Fannon Global Advisors, Josette Sheeran, the president of Canoe Inc., Ricardo Morales, director of strategic advisory at Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, and Alejandra Wood, a CESCO member and non-executive director at Codelco in Chile. So I'm going to start off. We don't have a vast amount of time to address what is a very large and difficult topic. So I'm going to ask all of the panelists to be concise in their comments. And I'd like to start off we've had, and I think everyone on this call and watching understands the backdrop, which is one where there has been a lot of Chinese investment and where China has become a really dominant player in both the market for electric vehicles, but also the production of batteries, and also the mining and processing of critical minerals. So maybe I'd like to start with Ricardo and go to Ricardo and just ask, tell us a bit about what China has done in the past 10, 20 years, both from a government level and on a corporate level. How has China been so successful at becoming this dominant player in critical minerals? And are there any lessons there for the rest of the world in the right policy response for other countries?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. No, I think it's a great way to start. Clearly, China started, the development of this value chain decades ago. The reasons why is kind of always difficult to say, but they definitely went ahead with investing in electric vehicles well ahead of the West, and they were able to take some of these technologies, replicate them, and develop the value chain. And I think the reasons why the success is really, without going too theoretical, it's really the model in China, right? The way that capital is deployed, the access to capital, the regulations when you need to develop some of these value chains are a lot different than we have in the West. So I'm not sure how much we can actually draw from China in terms of regulations or the way that they deploy capital, because they are the heart of how the Chinese economic model works. But what I do think there are lessons for the West is whether it is a result of that beneficial capital deployment model is to take more risks, right? And I think we have in the West certain value chains that have taken risks in the past, like technology, and we have seen the dividends in many ways. I think in the processing and extracting of critical materials, we can see how China has been a lot quicker to develop flow sheets. I'm going a little bit technical here, but essentially the ability of China to develop the processing technologies to extract, process, and get all these chemicals into the batteries is astonishing. We are trying to replicate, just to give an example, on lithium extraction, processing, especially the processing side, and second on the graphite processing. And we are really struggling in the West just to replicate what China has done over the last decade. So I think the risk taking on the technical side is what I think we should learn from China.
Thanks very much for that succinct statement of the problem, Ricardo. And I think that's a fascinating point about the risk taking. Frank, I'm going to come to you next. We have seen, and those of us who are journalists have written about, and everyone else has read a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US in the past year as this major US government response to the question of where are we going to get critical minerals from over the coming decades, and how are countries like the US going to reduce their reliance on China and the dominance of China in these markets. Frank, do you think, why don't you give us a 1 minute summary of what the IRA does and tell us, do you think it's going to work?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be with you all. The IRA is a significant program in the scale, as well as increasing the complexity of various subsidy schemes and incentive structures to catalyze domestic investment for critical minerals in the United States, and to accelerate the deployment of clean energy technologies, particularly electric vehicles, or inclusive of electric vehicles. We have really it's two different goals and objectives are being sought here, and we have a lack of clarity in the U.S. policy into which one is primary. The two goals being accelerated clean energy deployment to address the climate crisis, and otherwise, in the one area that gets overwhelming bipartisan U.S. consensus, which is a shocking thing these days, and that is to have a secure and reliable clean energy supply chain. What does that mean? That means to not focus on or rely upon or reduce our reliance upon regimes that are antithetical to U.S. or shared Western values, and also a supply chain that prizes human rights and environmental quality in the production, sourcing, and refinement of those critical minerals.
And do you think it's going to work?
I think if we, right now, we haven't had clarity on the rules. We're still waiting to understand this tension between climate action and clean energy deployment and the security of the supply chain. The Department of Treasury has yet to issue guidance on some of these key questions, which really addresses whether and to what extent it would be permissible for U.S. taxpayer money to effectively subsidize Chinese content or content from foreign entities of concern. That question has yet to be answered. Now it is working in certain ways for accelerating production refining. It's a lot easier to build a processing center, and it's a lot quicker and cleaner than it is to have manufacturing than it is to have a mine. So we have this tension, and with you know, government agencies in matters of foreign policy, we tend to like uncertainty. That creates optionality, but the market detests it. The market demands certainty. And so until the US government addresses some of these key questions and also coordinate that with European and other allied nations, I think the jury's still out.
Do you agree with the comment that Ricardo made earlier that that there's a problem in the West, that it's just a struggle to replicate the technological expertise that China has developed in terms of processing, for example, lithium? I mean, is there just simply a kind of an issue with expertise? I don't know if there are better chemists and lithium engineers in China than there are in the US, or if that's just a question of time and money.
I think there's no way we're going to replicate the Chinese experience, nor should we. We believe in the West of having, you know, capital should find a return on investment. There's a different incentive structure in China for some of these investments, and they're not always economic, nor are they to align with values such as human rights. And whether that's, and Congress has spoken to this issue in terms of the Forced Labor Prevention Act in the case of the Uyghurs and the development of solar panels in Xinjiang province. So I think we ought not try to replicate that. What we ought to do is mobilize our values and create a supply chain that we can be proud of. Your writing and others have described the exploitation that's occurring in the Southern Hemisphere for many of these minerals. And I think we need to put a stop to it. I think as we scale up the energy transition, the visibility of that supply chain is going to become more and more aware. People will become more aware, and the market will deselect. Now, the question is whether we in the West can reconcile with the concept of paying a little bit more for clean energy technologies. That's absolutely going to be instrumental. We need to have a price signal so investment can occur and companies can realize a return. So I would quibble a little bit with the concept of pursuing a China-like response. We ought not do that. We ought to be clear, though, and develop our own.
Thanks very much. I'd like to come to Alejandra next. We've been talking from the point of view of China and the US as to what those governments are doing and can do to incentivize supply of these critical minerals. Obviously, you're sitting, I don't know if you're in Chile right now, but your career is in Chile, and Chile is blessed with enormous resources of several of the most important of these minerals, particularly copper and lithium. Tell us, what is the experience of Chile in the copper industry, where Chile has a very long history, and what has gone right and what has gone wrong in Chilean government policy towards the copper industry, and what that tells us about what Chile should do when it comes to developing lithium and retaining some of the potential boom from lithium mining within Chile. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I'm going to try and be succinct here. Well, Chile last year celebrated its 50th anniversary of the nationalization of the large copper mining industry in what is today called Codelco, which is the main copper producer, state-owned. And then in the 80s decade, we had the mining code came into force, which is a legal body that established state ownership of the lands and deposits, mechanisms for the concessions and exploitation for the private sector. And together with this legal body, others were established to foster foreign investment, all of which had the impact of the fact that in 14 years, Chile almost quadrupled its production from 1.5 million tons to 5.5. And we were very well positioned for what's so-called the super cycle driven by China, which meant that from 2004 and for the whole decade, we benefited from these prices. And we also had the set of rules that meant we had very serious finance ministers and independent central bank, which maintained a rigorous fiscal policy that allowed the country saving significant surpluses coming from copper, which largely explains more than 80% of the economic growth of our country. So I think it was a good history, and I guess it's a very difficult phenomena, increasing production and such a long cycle of extremely high prices to repeat itself in history again. Today, Chile has decreased its market share from 36.9% in 2004 to 28% in 2019. And despite the fact that its production has practically stabilized in the last 17 years, which of course has required huge amount of investment, we still we are very challenged to maintain these levels of productions. Okay, and the main reason is geological, technological, economic, and in my opinion, the most important one, let's call it the socio-environmental reasons. I'm going to leave it to here because I know we don't have time. I would say the world wants copper, but not mining.
Yeah. Do you think there are any lessons, when we have these conversations in the US and Europe, for example, in the last few years about stimulating more domestic production of minerals? Are there any lessons from Chile in terms of how to make the process of approving new mines and stimulating investment smoother and faster over your 50-60-year experience in the copper mining industry?
Yeah, well, I would say these constraints are global, national, and regional all over the world. The same happens in my country. So I would say that a clear and sound set of rules in which, both private, public, and social society or civil society participate on the early stages should be something that tends to work, although it doesn't guarantee that there's going to be a speed up in mining, because let's see to history, there was mining in the US and in Canada, and then they got rid of it. And so how come they're going to go back and have mining again? It's going to be very difficult.
Thank you very much. Do we have Josette Sheeran on the call? I can't see her on the Zoom call, but maybe she's here somewhere. Josette, are you around? Perhaps not. In that case, I will remind everyone that if you'd like to ask questions, if you're in the audience, then please do send them either directly on the Zoom if you're on the Zoom or online. And why don't I take one of those now, because we have quite a few already. So here is one from online. And I think this is probably one for Ricardo. If China is the largest single market for EVs, is that market in the driver's seat in terms of battery technology standardization, critical minerals trading, infrastructure, etc.?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. They have developed the entire value chain, all the way from EV manufacturing, cell manufacturing, chemicals, cathode, anode manufacturing, and all the way up to controlling, the critical raw materials, by offtake agreements or in direct investment. So yes, that's the answer. And there's plenty of data out there, and we produce some of those graphics on how much China dominates in each part of the value chain, and processing is the one that is the most scary. Even if they still rely on a lot of imports for feedstocks, processing is very large. Cathode and anode is also very large. Anode is almost 100%. And then cell manufacturing is kind of 2/3. That's going to diminish as the West ramps up production. So, but yeah, today is the dominant force.
And just to pick out a bit more of the question, what does that mean for things like trading infrastructure? Do you expect to see, or are we already seeing, the key traders of these minerals being based in China, being Chinese companies, or is there?
Oh, definitely.
Is the Chinese dominance of the supply chain, leading to dominance of other elements as well?
Yeah, I think if you look at how much is traded on nickel, cobalt, lithium, the vast majority of that is traded in China, either spot basis or contract basis. But again, as the West ramps up production, there is definitely a way to see Western markets developing their own trading schemes and or pricing mechanisms. And I think going back to Frank's points earlier, one of the key questions is whether all these materials will cost more in the West, whether we will see different price regimes in the West for these materials, that they will be more expensive to get right for the Western standards.
Is that plausible? I mean, how could you see that working if you had one price in China and a different price in the West?
I think that's exactly what the IRA could help with. When you look at some of the elements that are going in there, is that if something in China costs 100 and in the West it's going to cost 200, that extra 100 needs to pay for via either higher prices. We definitely we're seeing premiums, country or project specific premiums being applied, and or the government is stepping in with capital and or OPEX. So the numbers are starting to match up. But of course, that doesn't mean there is a new price in the US for lithium, for example. But behind the scenes, you get the Chinese price plus a project-specific premium, but also some of the capital and or OPEX being offset by the IRA.
Frank, is that likely to be a sustainable solution for building an industry, to have one price in China and a different one in the West, with the government footing the bill for the difference?
Yeah, I would caution against the concept that it would be a price in China and otherwise. I don't think that would be really appropriate. I think what there would be, though, is an expectation of a certain type of auditing or accountability or transparency as to the provenance of the mineral and the way in which it was produced and processed. If we had that degree of transparency, then I think you would be able to apply the differential, the premia that would be associated with doing things responsibly. And there would be correspondingly, invite another supplier, and whether that's the Russian nickel or Chinese, whatever, you invite them to submit to the same level, a degree of parity as what would expect in a Western country. And if they choose not to submit, then to disclose, then it's kind of a question mark as to whether that's a responsible supply chain. There is precedent for this. The United States government, the Department of Commerce issued a trade investigation into Chinese solar panels. And several of the Chinese companies that were questioned refused to submit information compliant with, and so that creates the presumption that they're clearly in violation of the trade rules. So there is a precedent to do this. Number one. Number two, there's considerable discussion about all manner of carbon-related disclosures by corporates, and whether that's in the SEC or if that's in Europe. And I would venture that it should be easier to validate whether and to what extent you have forced labor in your supply chain than the tracking of invisible gases. And so if we're going to go down the road of a carbon disclosure regime, I think it's reasonable to expect there to be some kind of disclosure around human rights and environmental production.
I'd like to take that point on and also come back to something that Alejandro said earlier, which I think really encapsulates the issue very well, that the world wants the minerals but not the mining industry. We've got another question online, looking at ESG and this politically charged question of ESG, or politically charged three letters of ESG. And this is to really to any of you. How do you think, if the world does want critical minerals, what can policy do? What can policymakers do to change that conversation on the mining industry and to change this reality that the world wants minerals and not mining? And relatedly, the question we have from online: is this political backlash against ESG a good sign for mining investment? Which I guess raises this kind of issue of is the mining industry and is mining investment a kind of binary between more investment and more supply versus poor ESG standards, or is there a happy solution where you can have the greater supply and also improve standards on environmental, social, and governance issues? Frank, do you want to start us off, and then maybe we'll come to Alejandro as well?
Yeah, you bet. It is a tension to the extent to which the supply chain is opaque. If people had awareness of the way the supply chain is, and increasingly journalists have been exposing some of these discussions. The challenge that we have is there's not an alternative, and yet we have a driving force to address climate change. So the power of Chinese dominance here is not necessarily their ability to restrict supplies, which they've done recently again with germanium and gallium, but their ability to be the dominant swing producer and effectively flood the market to undermine the investment case for Western investment to develop an alternative supply. So journalists have written considerably and increasingly so on the DRC and cobalt and abhorrent conditions with children, et cetera. But at the same time, China didn't like the cobalt supply, pricing, so they announced that they were going to take action to exert greater control over cobalt pricing. The same month, the month of May, the one company that was developing a cobalt operation in the United States suspended operations because the pricing, they couldn't justify the investment. So we can't argue. We have to have a greater awareness of what is the supply chain today and how we can develop the supply chain of tomorrow and incent investment for developing that alternative supply chain. That's absolutely critical. And that goes back to paying more, some kind of differential pricing based on these values. But right now it doesn't exist at scale. And that's the challenge we find ourselves.
Alejandro, what's your take on how we should make mining, or what's the solution for making society willing to accept mining?
Well, I think it's quite an unresolved challenge, and I guess it's always been. The fact now is that we're on the public voice because energy is talking about mining, so we can see that as a chance to sort of expand this conversation and try to come to a solution. I would say the mining brand globally does not enjoy a great reputation, and its image of, being a pollutive industry, conservative and reactive to changes, especially among the younger population, is quite challenging. And its fame is, of course, it's up to now, it's not based on its increasingly evident virtuous effects, but on its environmental impacts on the territories and communities. And of course, in the case of Chile, these big open pit mines, tailing dams, and the use of water on desert areas and so forth. So it seems to be that society at a global and also at the local level is asking the mining activity to work on its value proposition that has to do with the type of mining that it should develop, how it is developed, and the benefits that it should generate. And of course, the evaluation of mining will depend both on the value proposition that it makes, but also on the invitation that society makes to mining. And here, public policies and governments are crucial. And at least in my country, we haven't seen a sort of a proactive change in regulation so as to foster transparency and a responsible mining, which includes more local content, local employment, and impact on local economies, just to mention, or the money coming from mining taxes designed to investment in technology and services, so that instead of only being exporting minerals, we could also import technologies and services, something that is more similar to what Canada or Australia does. All those kinds of policies are crucial for our countries to sort of, re-enchant themselves with the fact of being mining countries.
It sounds like the obvious conclusion of bringing in some of those policies from the point of view of the global mining industry is going to be, though, to add cost. Am I right?
Yeah.
So once again, we are adding costs. Another question for you, Alejandra, from our audience. Somebody is asking, if prices for these minerals increase, won't governments in many countries try to increase rent and their cut of the mining revenue? Is that what Chile is doing in lithium at the moment?
No, it has nothing to do with the taxing regime for lithium. In the case of lithium, what happens is something completely different to what I told happened to copper. We don't have a set of rules as clear, and we should have had them in place in 2010 because we knew what was going to happen, and we just as a country haven't been able to make up our minds to have certainty and clear rules for investing. And now we have a new strategy, which I think that is the right one to go forward, although it is very well challenged by the need of new technology, which hasn't been proved at an industrial scale. And also we're challenged about community licensing.
Okay, we're very nearly out of time. I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap up, and it really comes back to a point that that was made earlier about the uncertainty that faces investors in all of these minerals. And I think there's some wonderful charts in this IEF-FMF report that's been published showing just the range of different forecasts for demand for each of these metals across the different agencies that have made forecasts. And for example, you have 2040 demand for cobalt being anywhere from 58% of today's production to 725% of today's production, which really illustrates the challenges of investing. The question is from our audience and to Ricardo, which is, what is the role moving forward for futures pricing in providing market stability? Can futures be the answer to this uncertainty over future demand and pricing, and can they allow the stability and certainty needed to invest?
I think it will help, of course, but I mean, if we look at the more mature commodities like copper or others, the forward curve doesn't really inform investment decisions. It informs kind of trading and contract decisions. So I think you still will have the uncertainty of, trying to understand what is the business case for these commodities and what could be the medium to long-term price. And I think on the uncertainty of the forecast, even the 58% that you may have as the low case in some of those charts is going to be challenging enough anyway. So I think the way that I see it and we see it is that the uncertainty in this time is on the upside. So it's really how much upside there is out there rather than how much downside. And that's relatively unseen in the commodities markets. We always expect, the booms and busts of the commodities markets.
Okay, well, I think we've come up with more challenges and questions than we have answers, but I guess that's maybe inevitable of trying to tackle such a large question as what is the correct policy on critical minerals. Thank you very much to our three panelists for a very interesting conversation. I'm sure we could have talked for significantly longer, but our time is up, so I will hand it back to Tom. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack, and thank you to the panelists for another great session. And on that note, we're just going to turn it over back to the Secretary General of the International Energy Forum, Joe McMonagle, to really give some closing remarks. And thank you all again.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. I don't really have a lot of closing remarks. I think we heard a lot of fantastic commentary and analysis presented today. I also want to congratulate and thank the moderators, who I felt really teased out, I think, some of the main issues and challenges that we face on this topic. Let me just again thank the Payne Institute and Morgan and the Future of Minerals Forum and His Excellency for helping to co-host this event. As I said in my opening remarks, we're planning to do this as an annual event. Many of you who are familiar with the IEF know that we do an annual outlooks comparison report on oil and gas and sort of general transition technologies every February. It's one of our flagship events, and we co-host it with OPEC and the IEA, which happen to be on the executive board of the IEF. But we don't want to try to duplicate what others are doing. So we're not coming out with our own outlook on critical minerals. Instead, we're applying that model. Let's look at all the different outlook reports in the critical minerals sector and try to learn, what are they saying together? Where are the divergent analysis and scenarios, and try to learn and help the industry and policymakers and investors maybe help see around the corner this big challenge, because we have to keep moving on the transition. But obviously critical minerals is a big challenge meeting some of these objectives. So anyway, again, let me thank you all for participating, those watching online, both on the Zoom call and those watching the live stream on YouTube. Thank you again for joining us, and stay tuned for more on critical minerals and other topics related to the transition at the IEF website, ief.org, and also all of our social media channels as well. So thank you all, and have a good day or evening, depending on where you're joining us. Thank you.